never expected a weekend trip to an old museum to change everything I thought I knew about reality. It was supposed to be simple. A visit, a short stay, nothing more. Daniel's grandfather had extended the invitation out of nowhere. Just a letter in the mail, no phone call, no email. There was something strange about that alone. Who sends handwritten invitations in this day and age? Daniel and I had been friends for years. The kind of friendship where we didn't need words to know what the other was thinking. So when he handed me the letter that evening, his face unreadable, I knew something wasn't right. I unfolded it carefully. The paper felt old, thick, textured, the edges slightly frayed as if it had been handled too many times before it reached us. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, written in ink that had slightly bled into the fibers of the page. Daniel, it's been too long. You should come visit. There is something I need you to see. It is important. Do not delay. Bring a friend if you must. Grandfather. That was it. No details. No explanation. Just those few sentences. I looked up at Daniel. He was staring at the letter like it was something dangerous. When's the last time you talked to him? I asked. Daniel hesitated. Years. That didn't sit right with me. There was something in his voice. An unease I hadn't heard before. He wasn't just surprised to get the letter. He was worried. I glanced back at the words. Do not delay. The phrasing felt strange, urgent, as if his grandfather knew we'd hesitate, as if he was expecting it. And then there was the last part. Bring a friend if you must. Like he knew Daniel wouldn't want to come alone. That should have been enough reason to say no. But Daniel was already checking the map, looking up directions to a place I had never heard of. It was 3 hours away, deep in the countryside, far from any major city. No website, no online records. It wasn't on any travel lists, no mentions in any forums. A museum that seemed to exist outside of time itself. I don't know why, but the thought of that made my stomach tighten. I almost told Daniel to forget about it, that it wasn't worth it. But instead I said, when do we leave? We drove in silence for the first hour. The highway stretched endlessly in front of us, bathed in the dim glow of our headlights. The further we went, the fewer cars we saw. Eventually, the pavement gave way to cracked back roads, then to dirt paths that wound through dense forests, the trees towering on either side like silent sentinels. I don't remember seeing a single house, no gas stations, no signs, just mile after mile of empty road, stretching into nothingness. I checked my phone. No signal. Daniel must have noticed, because he glanced at me and muttered, "Yeah, same." It had been raining on and off, the kind of drizzle that made everything look darker than it should be. Our windshield wipers groaned with each slow pass, barely keeping up. The headlights struggled against the fog that was beginning to creep across the road, thickening with each passing mile. And then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the road. I barely had time to react before we passed it, the shape swallowed by the mist almost as quickly as it appeared. I turned my head, but it was gone. "Did you see?" I started. "No," Daniel said immediately. Too quickly. A cold weight settled in my chest. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, just a trick of the rain and fog. But I knew Daniel saw it too. I could tell by the way his hands tightened around the steering wheel, his knuckles pale, his breathing suddenly too steady. Neither of us said another word. The museum appeared out of nowhere. One moment, we were surrounded by endless trees, the road stretching into oblivion. The next, we turned a corner, and there it was, looming at the end of the path, its silhouette stark against the night sky. It was massive, larger than I expected. The architecture was strange, like it had been built in different eras, with pieces stitched together without logic or symmetry. The main building was grand, almost like an old European estate, but the wings that extended on either side looked different. Older, the stonework rougher, the windows narrower. Some parts looked newer, but not in a way that felt comforting. More like replacements, as if parts of the original structure had been taken away and rebuilt with whatever was available. It gave the whole place a patchwork appearance. Something incomplete, something wrong. There were no lights except for a single lantern hanging beside the massive double doors, its flickering glow barely illuminating the stone steps leading up to the entrance. Daniel cut the engine, and the silence that followed was absolute. We sat there for a long moment, neither of us moving. Then, without a word, Daniel opened his door. The gravel crunched beneath our feet as we made our way to the entrance. The air was thick, damp from the rain, carrying the scent of old wood and something else. Something faint, almost metallic. I ran my fingers along the wooden door. The grain was deep, uneven, as if it had been carved by hand long ago. There was no doorbell, no knocker. Daniel reached for the handle, but before he could touch it, the door creaked open on its own. A long hallway stretched ahead, dimly lit by flickering candle sconces. The walls were lined with portraits, old, faded paintings of people I didn't recognize. Their eyes followed us as we stepped inside. The air inside was colder than outside. A strange, heavy stillness clung to the space, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Then, from above, a voice. "You're here." We both looked up. Daniel's grandfather was standing at the top of the grand staircase watching us. He was taller than I expected, his frame thin but rigid, as if his bones had been pulled too tight beneath his skin. His face was lined with age, deep shadows accentuating the hollows beneath his eyes. But it was his expression that unsettled me the most. Not relief, not warmth, just something unreadable. He descended the stairs slowly, each step deliberate. When he reached the bottom, he held out his hand, not to shake Daniel's, but to pass him something. A folded sheet of paper. Daniel took it, unfolding it carefully. The handwriting was neat, careful, precise. I read over his shoulder. The rules. I frowned. What is this? His grandfather didn't answer right away. He simply watched us, his gaze steady, unblinking. Then, in a voice just above a whisper, he said, "Once you enter, you must follow the rules. Always follow the rules." There was something about the way he said it. Not like a suggestion, not like advice, like an order. And in that moment I realized, this wasn't just a museum, and we weren't just visitors. Daniel's grandfather didn't say anything else. He just watched. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. I could hear the slow tick of an unseen clock somewhere in the house, each second dragging longer than it should. Daniel's fingers tightened around the paper. He swallowed hard, then read aloud. 1. Do not touch the exhibits. That one made sense, sort of. Museums had rules like that. But the phrasing felt wrong. Not please refrain from touching the exhibits. Not do not damage the artifacts. Just do not touch them, like something would happen if we did. 2. If you hear whispering after midnight, do not respond. I looked up. What the hell does that mean? Daniel's grandfather still didn't answer. His face was unreadable, but there was something about his eyes. Not fear exactly. Something deeper. a kind of exhaustion. Daniel kept reading. 3. Always leave a coin at the foot of the staircase before bed. I frowned. Why? His grandfather finally spoke. Just do it. His voice was even, but there was something underneath it. A finality. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. And if we don't? His grandfather's expression didn't change. You don't want to find out. My mouth went dry. Daniel hesitated, then moved to the last rule. 4. Never enter the West Wing. This time, he didn't ask why. Neither did I, because I already knew we weren't going to get an answer. The air in the museum felt heavier now, as if the rules had changed something, shifted the atmosphere in an invisible way. I glanced around the vast lobby. The exhibits loomed in the dim candlelight, shadows stretching unnaturally across the polished floor. Statues and mannequins dressed in historical clothing stood behind glass cases, their frozen expressions too lifelike, their eyes reflecting the flickering flames in a way that made them seem aware. Above us, the second-floor balcony wrapped around the entire perimeter of the hall, its railing lined with more figures, more statues, more eyes. Watching. Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. Okay, he muttered. This is weird. I almost laughed at how much of an understatement that was, but I didn't, because something about this place was making it hard to breathe. His grandfather turned, moving toward the staircase. He climbed the steps slowly, each footfall echoing in the cavernous space. Your rooms are on the east side, he said. Stay there after dark. He didn't turn around as he spoke, didn't look at us. Daniel and I exchanged glances. Then, at the top of the staircase, his grandfather stopped. I lock the main entrance at night, he said, voice quiet. Daniel tensed. Why? His grandfather turned his head just slightly, his profile half lit by the candle sconces. You'll understand soon enough. And then he disappeared down the hallway, leaving us alone in the vast, empty lobby. The rules sat between us on the bed, the paper looking older under the yellow glow of the bedside lamp. Daniel hadn't said much since we came upstairs. He just sat on the edge of the mattress, elbows on his knees, staring at the list. Do you think he's just messing with us? I asked. Daniel exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. Maybe. He didn't sound convinced. Neither was I. I glanced at the door to our room. It was sturdy, thick wood, with an old-fashioned lock beneath the handle, the kind that needed an actual key. Something about that made me uneasy. I checked my phone. Still no signal. Daniel leaned back against the headboard. I mean, the first rule makes sense. The exhibits are probably fragile. I nodded, but my fingers tapped against the edge of the mattress. What about the whispering one? Daniel didn't answer, because there was no logical explanation for that one, or the coin, or the West Wing. I tried to shake the feeling creeping up my spine. We were overthinking it. It was just an old building. Just an old man with a weird sense of humor. Nothing more. And then, a knock. Software. Muffled. Not at our door. Somewhere down the hall. Daniel sat up straight. I held my breath. Silence. We glanced at each other. Another knock. This time, it came from behind the wall. From inside the museum. The knock had stopped. We sat there, frozen, waiting for something else. Another sound. Another whisper. Anything. But the silence that followed was worse. heavy, waiting. Like whatever was behind that door had all the time in the world. I exhaled slowly, trying to shake off the unease curling in my stomach. Maybe we should... A sound. Not a knock this time. A shuffling noise. From inside Daniel's room. We turned at the same time, our heads snapping toward his door. Daniel stood, his movements slow, hesitant. He pressed his ear against the wood. I could see his pulse at his throat. Too fast, too unsteady. I stepped closer, barely breathing. And then, a whisper. Low, faint, coming from inside. Daniel jerked away from the door. What the hell? The whispering stopped. I swallowed hard. Is there anyone in there? We both knew the answer. We had locked the door before we left. No one had gone inside. And yet, for a few long, awful seconds, I swore I could hear breathing on the other side. The room was empty. We searched everything. Under the bed, the closet, even the walls, pressing our hands against the old wood, listening. Nothing. But the air inside felt different now. Heavier, like something had been here. Or maybe it still was. Daniel exhaled sharply, raking a hand through his hair. I don't like this. I didn't either. We left the room, shutting the door behind us. But I couldn't shake the feeling that when we returned, something would be different. It started small. A mannequin in the hallway, dressed in 18th century clothing, standing in the exact same position every time we passed. Except something was off. I couldn't explain it, but I knew it hadn't been standing quite like that before. The tilt of its head, the way its fingers curled ever so slightly. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Then, an hour later, I passed it again, and this time, its hand was raised. Like it was reaching for something. Like it was reaching for me. The voices came next. Muffled conversations drifting through the hallways. Too soft to make out the words, but not the tone. Low, urgent, like someone was arguing just around the corner. Except every time we checked, no one was there. That night, we ate dinner in silence. Daniel's grandfather barely spoke. He ate methodically, his hands slow and steady, as if he'd done this exact routine 1,000 times before. The candlelight flickered against the stone walls, making the shadows stretch and shift. I kept thinking about the mannequin, about the whispering. And then I asked, before I could stop myself, "How long have you lived here?" His grandfather didn't look up. A long time. Daniel's fork scraped against the plate. Has it always been like this? His grandfather finally lifted his gaze. His eyes were sharp, watchful. You should get some rest. He didn't answer the question. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The rain had started again, a soft tapping against the window. I turned onto my side, trying to block out the strange unease twisting inside my chest. Then, a creak. I tensed. It came from the hallway. I held my breath, listening. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming closer. Daniel and I were the only ones here, or so we thought. The museum had a way of breathing, not in the way a person does. Chest rising and falling, air slipping through lungs, but in the way something unseen shifts when no one is looking. A hush before something happens. A stillness so deep, you don't notice it until it's gone. And then something moves, something changes. We didn't realize it at first. How could we? It was a small mistake. A brush of fingers. Barely a touch. But the moment Daniel's skin met the wood of that violin, everything changed. We were wandering the exhibits again. It had become a habit, walking the endless halls, never speaking about how each room felt different than before. The air inside them heavier. The statues still. Too still. The painting's eyes seeming to track us. It was Daniel who saw it first. The violin sat in a glass case, its surface worn, the strings frayed from age. Something about it seemed out of place, even in this museum. A small plaque beneath it read, "Property of L. Fenwick, last played 1876. That was all. No backstory, no date of arrival, just a name. Daniel tilted his head. Looks expensive. I nodded, but didn't say anything. Because the longer I looked at it, the more something felt off. The strings were frayed, yes, but they looked used, as if someone had played it recently. Daniel's fingers hovered just above the glass. He hesitated, then pulled his hand back. I exhaled, but then the lights above us flickered. A single, stuttering blink, and the glass was gone. I blinked. No sound. No shatter. 1 second it was there. The next, it wasn't. Like it had never existed. Daniel's hand dropped. His fingers brushed the wood. Just for a second. Barely a touch. But the moment he did, the lights above us exploded. The sound was deafening. Shards of glass rained down, scattering across the floor. I flinched, shielding my face, my heartbeat slamming against my ribs. The museum groaned, a deep, guttural creaking, like the very foundation of the building was shifting. I turned to Daniel. His face was pale. His hand still hovered over the violin, fingers trembling. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I opened my mouth, then froze. Because somewhere beyond the exhibits, beyond the velvet ropes and locked glass cases, there was a sound, faint, impossible. The slow, uneven drag of a bow against strings. Daniel ripped his hand away from the violin, stumbling back. The noise stopped, but the air around us had changed. The lights flickered again, dimmer this time. And then I noticed it. The mannequins, the statues, the paintings, every single one of them, turned toward us. A sharp click echoed through the hall. We spun around. The west wing door. The one that had been locked. The one we were never supposed to enter. It was ajar. A breath of cold air drifted from the darkness beyond it, carrying a scent that didn't belong in a museum. Old. Damp. Like earth after a storm. Like a grave after it's been opened. Daniel swallowed hard. We didn't do that, right? I didn't answer. Because something was standing in the doorway. A figure. Not moving. Not breathing. Just watching. And then Daniel's grandfather's voice behind us. Sharp. Panicked. "You've doomed us all." The words left the old man's mouth like a curse. "You've doomed us all." His voice cracked. Not with anger, but with something far worse. Fear. Daniel and I stood frozen, barely able to breathe. The door to the west wing yawned open, spilling out darkness so thick it felt alive. And standing there, watching from the threshold, was the figure. Unmoving. Silent. But something shifted behind it. A deeper darkness. A shape pressing forward. Something that wanted out. The grandfather lunged, his hands veined and shaking, grabbed the door with a strength I didn't think he had. "Help me," he shouted. For a second, neither of us moved. Then Daniel snapped out of it, rushing forward. I followed. We shoved against the door, but the wood was fighting us. A force, something cold and unseen, pushing back. The gap shrank, inch by inch, until finally, slam. The sound echoed through the museum like a gunshot. The air in the hallway shifted, like the building had just exhaled. Then, silence. Daniel stepped back, panting. The grandfather sagged against the door, his breath rattling in his chest. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Daniel turned to him. His voice was shaking. What the hell was that?" The old man didn't answer. His eyes darted to Daniel's hand. And for the first time, I saw it too. His fingers. They were pale. Too pale. The veins beneath his skin, darkening by the second. Like something was spreading. The old man grabbed Daniel's wrist. "You touched it." Daniel tried to jerk away. "What?" "The violin," I whispered. "You touched it." A slow, creeping horror settled over Daniel's face. His breath quickened. It was just a second. The grandfather's grip tightened. No one plays that violin and walks away the same. Daniel's eyes flickered with something. Anger. Fear? "I didn't play it," he snapped. "I barely touched it." The grandfather didn't blink. And then, soft. So soft I almost didn't hear it. A sound. Faint. Rising from somewhere in the museum. A single, drawn-out violin note. Daniel yanked his arm away. The sound faded, but the veins in his hand kept darkening. The old man swayed on his feet, pressing a hand to his face. For a brief second, I saw his skin ripple. And then I saw it. The way his face seemed to shift, his eyes too deep, his mouth too wide. A glimpse of something beneath his skin. Something that wasn't human. His voice came out lower now, almost distant. "You have to leave." Daniel shook his head. "We've been trying. You locked us in." The grandfather's mouth twitched. "The museum doesn't let you go." A sharp chill ran down my spine. "What?" He turned to me, and this time, I knew. The thing in front of me, whatever it was, it wasn't just Daniel's grandfather anymore. It was something wearing him. He exhaled, voice brittle. "You broke the rule. The museum knows." Daniel gritted his teeth. "Then tell us how to fix it." The old man didn't answer right away. He just stared. Then finally, in a whisper, "You don't." The lights above us flickered again, one by one, blinking out. Something moved in the darkness. A shape, watching, waiting. The grandfather stepped back. His breathing had become ragged now, his body trembling. I grabbed Daniel's arm. "We have to go." He didn't move. "We can't," he whispered. "The door is..." Then we heard it. Boom. The front doors, slamming shut, sealing us in. The grandfather's face twisted. "There's only one way out now." He turned, pointed, to the west wing door. Still shut, but the darkness beneath it, thick, moving. And from the other side, a voice. So close, so wrong, whispering Daniel's name. The west wing door groaned as it opened. The darkness inside was thick, too thick, like ink, swallowing the light before it could touch anything beyond the threshold. And in that darkness, something moved. Daniel was the first to step forward. I grabbed his arm. "Don't." He didn't look at me. His eyes were locked ahead, his breathing shallow. And then, the voice, low, garbled, "Come in." The grandfather stumbled back, his face twisted in fear. "You don't understand," he muttered. "You don't know what's inside." Daniel didn't hesitate. He stepped forward. I lunged to stop him. But the moment his foot crossed the threshold, the door vanished. The entire hallway around us shifted. The old museum walls, gone. No dust, no decay, only a different place, entirely. A corridor, clean, polished. A row of display cases stretching into the distance. Each one filled with figures. Figures standing perfectly still. Figures that looked alive. Daniel's breath hitched. I turned in slow horror, taking in the scene. The figures inside the glass. They were breathing. Their chests barely rising. Their fingers twitching. Their eyes wide open. Alive. Preserved. I staggered back. "What is this place?" The grandfather's voice was hollow. "It's not a museum," he whispered. "It's a prison." Daniel turned to him, his face pale. "You knew about this?" The old man swallowed. "This museum doesn't collect objects," he said. "It collects people." My stomach churned. Daniel took a slow step forward, his eyes locked on the figures in the glass. And then, he stopped, staring, his mouth slightly open, his skin even paler now. Because the figure in the closest case was him. A perfect replica. A still, unmoving version of Daniel. Frozen behind the glass. But its eyes, they weren't blank. They were watching. They were following him. Daniel turned to me, his face a mask of terror. He stepped back, his breath shuddering. And that's when the reflection moved on its own. Not to mimic him, not to mirror his step, but to reach forward, to press its palm against the glass. Daniel jolted away, and his reflection smiled. I grabbed his arm. "Daniel, we need to..." Then the lights flickered. A sharp crack splintered through the silence, and one by one, the glass cases began to open. We didn't stop running. We couldn't stop. The hallways twisted around us, reshaping, leading us in circles. Figures shifted in the shadows. The whispers followed. And then, a door. Not the entrance we had come through. Not the West Wing. Something else. Something that hadn't been there before. We didn't question it. We just ran through it. And the moment we crossed the threshold, we were outside. The museum behind us. Dark. Silent. Still. As if nothing had happened. As if none of it had ever existed. Daniel's breath was ragged. His hands shook. I turned to him, my voice unsteady. "Are you..." Then I saw it. His reflection. In the museum's glass doors. It wasn't mirroring him. It wasn't him. It was the other Daniel. Smiling. Watching. Waiting. And then, as I stared, it winked. We survived. But the museum wasn't finished with us. And now, it's waiting for you. Would you visit? Would you follow the rules? Or would you break them?